There is a fifth dimension.
About the unknown.
Beyond that which is known to man.
The Garden of Thought.
The Babylon Project was our last best hope for peace.
Unexplained.
Mythologies.
This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call
The Garden of Thought with Jeff Lippman.
Eventually, our sun will grow cold and go out.
You're listening to something much bigger, something hidden in plain sight.
It won't just take us. It'll take Marilyn Monroe and Lao Tzu and Einstein. All of us was for nothing unless we go to the stars.
What you're about to learn will completely change the way you experience your mind, your thoughts, and yourself.
Let's make sure that history never forgets the name.
The Garden of Thought.
Welcome into the garden, and this week we are welcoming back, returning Jeff, a different Jeff, Dr. Jeffrey Zurek. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, and I'm glad you had me back on to chat about something that I'm only kind of adjacent to, but it'll be fun.
It will be fun. So, just so that you know a little bit about Jeff, first of all, he's a geophysicist. He is also a volcanist. I don't know if that's separate or part and parcel. I'm sure he told me last show, and that's what I'm trying to get to, is that he's been on before, which is what returning guest means. And the prior show is called Shake, Rattle, and Roll. So we talked about basics of geology and sort of like what's, the Earth from the core up, and a lot of things about earthquakes, volcanoes, and fun things like that. Hence the name Shake, Rattle, and Roll. He's coming to us from the province of British Columbia, and as I mentioned, he's got a PhD. He is the senior geophysicist for Initial Exploration Services. He's got a wealth of an educational background, but we talked about all of that on the other show. No need to do it again and jump right into it. Glad that you are doing well. Thank you for agreeing to come back. How are things in Canada?
Oh, well, depends on who you ask. Me personally, I'm doing great. I just need to correct you. I thought by last time that I gave you a CV, this would have been on there, but I guess not. I actually work for computational geosciences now as a geophysicist, and volcanology-wise, when I studied volcanoes, I just applied geophysics to active volcanoes. So I can be both at the same time. They're not necessarily separate. But yeah, I mean, life is good for me personally, of course, with the economy kind of in a downward slow spiral, which is part of the reason why we're here to talk about something in some respects, isn't it?
It is indeed. So, listen, we go down strange rabbit holes, and by we, I mean me, on the Garden Show. And some time ago, okay, so let me back up a little bit. So, a lot of what's going on, in my view, in the United States of America, because you have to be careful when you say America. Most people know you're talking about the United States, but in fact, Canada and Mexico and the rest of North America, everything north of Panama, the Panama Canal is North America, and everything south of that is also America. It's South America. So I don't want to, and I'm married to a South American, so I should not be snooty. And my guest is from Canada. So in the United States, we're sort of doing like a Fortress America thing here, where we're trying to onshore all of the economy, or at least that's the titular strategy behind tariffs and America first and things like that. Whether it's playing out that way or not, that's not the subject of the show. I'm sure I'll have plenty of other people to talk about that, unless something happens to me in the interim. But part of that is drill, baby, drill, and the U.S. is in fact a net energy exporter, and we have ample energy supplies. We have oil, we frack, we do this, we do that. We're building solar, we're killing lots of birds with wind and all that other exciting stuff. We even have some nuclear. But what I didn't know is that there's a whole bunch of different grades and weights of petroleum, and they're not found everywhere and at once in one place. There's different grades and types of petroleum around the world, and they're all used for different things. And so even if we quintupled our energy production, drill baby drill all day long, we would still need to import types of oil for differences in things like airplane fuel and plastics versus diesel versus car fuel versus like all the things. It was like a million different things. And I remember I saw some chart and it was like 9 or 10 different grades of petroleum. Like, yeah, I could talk about this, but that's dull. Let's get someone who knows something about it. So I asked Dr. Jeff, and he said, yeah, I don't know too much about it, but I'll look into it for you. And now here he is, sort of on the spot. So what did you find out?
Well, I guess the better way to think about this is I looked a bit more into the history and the geopolitical side of things, together with my geological know-how, to broaden out the understanding of why things are the way they are, as opposed to jumping into the boring details of individual thicknesses and weights of oil, crude oil, sweet crude versus heavy crude. I mean, a little bit, but not to that kind of granular detail, because I don't think that's really useful to the average person.
Who knows? But I do know that, that it's not just that the weights of the oil are different and they're used for different things. You need different types of refineries and different refinery capacity. And we, again, the United States of America, we're already pretty short on refineries as it is. And I don't, my ample knowledge of politics is that very few people want a refinery built where they live. So, because they smell, they take up a lot of space. There's always fires coming out of spouts and things like that. And it's a little bit disconcerting. It's a little post-apocalyptic, little Blade Runner-ish looking. And they smell and they take up a lot of space, and there's loud trucks and things happening there as well, and there needs to be water nearby, and then the water gets polluted and stuff like that. So it's not only that we don't have enough refineries, we don't have all of the right kinds of refineries, and I don't know where the heck they would be built anyway.
It's actually a little more complicated than that. I mean, you actually have to go back to the 1970s. Maybe we should go back even further, actually.
Let's do that.
Yeah, because I did an episode on leaded gasoline and unfortunately learned a lot more about the beginnings of the oil industry than I really wanted to know. But the original oil industry came up in part because of prohibition. Yeah, I know, because burning of alcohol was actually the most common fuel way back in the day. Okay. And then somewhere along the way, alcohol became evil within the United States of America, and it actually became more expensive to burn alcohol to have light for electricity than it was to burn kerosene oil. Everywhere else in the world, and I mean everywhere else in the world, alcohol was cheaper. And so it was actually used for that. So all these light crude, so there's relatively what we call sweet, so you don't need to break it down into a whole bunch of different things, really started to take off underneath this kind of regulatory regime. And then it got into the automobiles and then took off for the rest of everyone else. But it was that fight that actually started this whole thing, which is absolutely fascinating. Like, there was a war, quote unquote, between alcohol and oil was America's answer because alcohol was evil.
Fantastic. That is, I mean, and hopefully that had something to do with like the second French and Indian War that I've never heard of.
I don't think that, I'm not aware of an actual war. It was more like, how two products end up battling it out in the marketplace and then one wins, right? And so oil ended up winning in part because of marketing, but we don't need to get into that. That's separate.
It's like succession, except with commodities.
Yeah, exactly. So, you had, to begin with, this really light crude that you could use for different things like fuel really, really easily in the beginning. And the US had a lot of it. But as that easy stuff that you didn't need these huge, like complex cracking of different carbon bonds because it's just maybe I should back up. So oil doesn't come in just one flavor. When it's light, that means it's closer to like gasoline and stuff that you use every day. It's pourable and stuff like that. When it's crude, it tends to be like a thick sludge. So the beginning of the oil industry was this nice, light, easy to use crude. But as all that stuff got drilled and used, and about 1970-ish, that thing came around, it was like, we've only got 30 years left of oil. You probably heard that many times throughout your life, right, Jeff?
Actually, I do remember that because I was born in '68, so some of my formative memories were of the fuel crisis and the rationing, and based on your license plate number, you could get fuel on every other day and things like that. In at least in New York, I don't know if that was the case anywhere, but long lines at the gas station. Nobody was happy with Ford, then they weren't happy with Carter, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so there was that because we weren't finding new areas of this light crude at the time. We also didn't have the technology we do today, which is at least temporarily solve that problem. So we started to look at heavier and heavier sources, and all the oil that was coming online was coming from Venezuela or Mexico, and it was all this heavy crude. You needed some way to refine it, and you needed some way to fuel the vehicles and the military within the United States. So they started to like retrofit all of their refineries to be able to crack this heavy crude. And by cracking, I mean you would heat it up and like finish the process that the geology was already doing. So that's how oil gets made. You get all that plant material buried deep underneath the ground. It heats up, it's under pressure, and those carbon molecules start to break down into simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler. And that's why we have natural gas, that's why we have oil, etc. So they're just speeding up that.
So it's like the opposite process of a diamond, like the carbon turns into coal and then it turns into a harder, smaller diamond. It's the opposite. It starts sludgy. I guess at some point there's probably something solid, but it starts sludgy and over a long amount of time becomes more liquidy.
Yeah, and to be fair, with coal, it's usually like hard plant material that is doing this. When we're starting to talk about oil, it's usually things like plankton and the like. You're not talking about trees necessarily becoming oil. It's not to say that they can't, but they end up being coal. And as part of becoming coal, there is also natural gas and other products that are also with some of that sometimes.
Is this why plankton could never get the recipe to the Krabby Patty? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. There's always a SpongeBob reference somewhere, right?
As there should be.
So as part of a way to keep these refineries going, which used to be all based in the United States, they saw where everything else was going and said, okay, heavy crude is the future, and they retrofitted. And this happened all the way through the 80s and 90s to where the U.S. was the best at it, you know? Once Canadian crude came online, which is a bit later in the 90s, you know, we didn't have that ability here in Canada to be able to refine that. But the US did. And so we shipped it all to the US. And meanwhile, they've also built ports and had all this infrastructure and supply chain lines through the Gulf of Mexico to bring all of this crude from Venezuela and Mexico right into the States, into these refineries in the Gulf. So you got really good at it, and it cost a lot of money to be able to retrofit that. Not to mention, because it's so intensive to use, you can get it at a discount price, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so you're not paying very much for it. You're really good at it. And now you're getting all this other stuff from it, from the heavy crude. Yes, you're still getting the diesel. Yes, you're still getting the gasoline. But you're also getting all the material for like jet fuel and asphalt and, you know, tar for roofs and things. So it was a really lucrative thing. I mean, Canada would send you guys the oil. You would turn around and sell it back to us. In fact, you still do that.
They're fantastic. Listen, this is just to repay you for Canadian Club.
Come on. Canadian Club is good. Anyway.
It's not bad. It really isn't.
And in today's context, I mean, if you take out the oil exports of Canada or the imports of the U.S. of Canadian oil, if you take that out of the mix of trade goods, we have a pretty significant deficit with the United States of America. So it really is not, I don't know, which is why this whole thing is kind of amusing when you look at it in its total areas. Like when you look at the whole picture, you're like, okay, sure.
Yeah, I have yet to have an economist on. I have yet to look for an economist, but the people who are into politics and have some credentials, they sort of scratch their heads at it. And my understanding from actual economists is like there's like maybe 5% of economists in the world agree with this function at all, and they're all in the United States. And 95% of the economists in the United States don't agree with it, and like 99% of everywhere else in the world thinks that this is bad economics. And from a common sense standpoint, it also doesn't seem to make much sense. But anyway, this is probably... You probably shouldn't have, you don't have a geologist on to, it's funny because you have a doctorate, I have a doctorate, but I was having this discussion in the lawyers' Facebook group. It's like, when somebody says, is there a doctor in the house? No one's looking for a lawyer. And I'm like, yeah, they're not looking for, a professor of English literature, or a doctor of education either. They want a medical doctor, but we all have doctorates. Anyway, but you don't have a doctor of geophysics physics on a show to talk about macro and microeconomics, except to the extent that it ties directly into geo.
Yeah. I mean, I can't get into beyond the headline numbers, right? I don't know. Yeah, I can reiterate the headline numbers just like the best of them, but beyond that, in other words, I'm no worse than your talking head on CNN.
Well, you're no worse than our president, who at some point said that he collected $17 trillion worth of tariffs, which would have made him the greatest economic president in the history of the world. He could just put that towards the deficit, and the deficit is more than halved right away. And all of a sudden, interest rates would go down and it'd be remarkable. As it turns out, it's not anywhere near that. Surprise, surprise. And apparently, with some of by the time this drops, who knows what the courts will do, but it is possible that the tariffs will be decided to be unconstitutional, and they'll all have to be refunded, probably with interest also. So, back to oil.
Back to oil. Well, the one nice thing I got to say in the situation that the States is in, you're getting all this heavy crude from Canada, because we can replace the dwindling supply from Mexico, and well, you're not getting anything from Venezuela right now for obvious reasons. But you have all this.
Venezuela is state number 51.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's okay. They can beat us. I don't need to be 51.
All right. Greenland 52. Everyone except DC.
What?
DC will wait forever.
Yeah. Where was I going with this now?
Oh, you were saying that that you were replacing
the shale gas. So the shale boom, the idea of fracking. So fracking wasn't around in the 80s, right? The ability to sideways drill is something relatively new. It was developed over the 2000s, and then really got going during the Obama years, being able to push in essentially water or fluid to hydrofrack the ground, releasing both oil and gas. And being able to take
fracture, right? Because before that frack was the curse song from Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, it came out about the same time as they were starting to do that. But yeah, completely unrelated.
Remember the original Battlestar Galactica, like from 1981.
Oh, I read the book. I don't remember that.
Well, maybe we didn't send it to Canada.
I just remember the book. I read the book. But again, my memory is hazy on that kind of stuff. But yeah, so when you're pushing in all this fluid, you're like releasing it from the rock. And all of a sudden you can access things that people in the 70s and early 80s never thought were possible. Right. So meanwhile, all your refineries have switched over to something to frack this heavy, or not frack, to crack or refine this heavy sludge this non-sweet crude, and then you have this other really light sweet crude. So what refineries are actually doing is they're actually mixing in the sweet crude to some of the heavier crude to speed up the process. So you're still using your local or your in-country specific oil to save money in this part of the refining process. So you're still using everything. It just doesn't make any sense to then retrofit and go using only the shale, especially when you can take in at a real cheap price and then resell it to all of us on the periphery.
Do refineries, I mean, this is going to be, I don't know if this is a sensible analogy or not, but like on a stove, you can raise the temperature and you can lower the temperature and come out with different results. Is a refinery one speed only, or can you change? Is there like in essence a dial where you could refine to different levels in the same refinery?
You can definitely refine to different levels in the same refinery. Specifically how they do that, I don't know, but it is temperature and pressure dependent.
Okay. And it's probably a pain in the arse to do. I mean, it's not like, you have when we build cars, one factory builds sedans, another one builds trucks. So, I mean, it's probably apples to oranges to an extent, but, you have a machine, and by machine, I mean a method, to do something. You have efficiencies built in, and then there's probably a whole lot of moving parts that make it difficult or impractical, even though you can do something at the same refinery, to actually make it worthwhile to do it at the same refinery.
Yeah, so it's very similar, except the cost value is significantly more for oil refineries to do something like that.
That's it.
Yeah, same idea, but exponentially more
expensive. Well, I'm actually almost surprised it's exponentially more expensive, but yeah, I mean that is even more of a bar to it. Of course, a bar to the engine, and I'm really not even sure if there's a difference with the runoff, the waste, the smoke, the smog. If there's different standards in different parts of the country that have environmental issues that make it impractical, impossible, or illegal. I just don't know, and I don't expect you to know the answers to that. Also, I just know that there's always wrinkles in the world that we don't even think about, like when you looked into oil in the first place that had to do with prohibition and alcohol. I mean, the fact that those two things are related is really, really strange, but now that you mention it, makes a heck of a lot of sense. I mean, listen, I remember, I've seen all the old movies and whatever, like, like the Bronze Age and, the Roman Empire and stuff. Oh, look, well, guys, we thought about the Roman Empire once. Like, there we go. So there's been oil in their lamps, and Greek fire, and, you boiled oil and you threw it on the offenders who are invading the castle or storming the castle, and burned them in hideous ways. So, oil being burned has been around, being used as fuel has been around for a while.
But it's small quantities, right? It wasn't like the oil coming from the earth. It was oil from plants and animal products, right? It's completely different type of oil.
I knew blubber from whales,
yeah. You're right. Oil's been around for a long time, but not the oil like out of the ground. That came much, much later.
Yeah, but you know what? I didn't even think about that either. Yeah, it was animal fats mostly. But yeah, absolutely. Good. Another excellent point. See, that's why you're the doctor of the relevant science.
Yeah, that's why you brought me on.
Well, yeah, that's why. I mean, I think the audience was entitled to have one Jeff that makes sense every now and then.
Oh, come on. I thought you were also going to have me on to talk about continental shelves, too.
I absolutely want to have you on about continental shelves. In fact, I actually saw a good video about that on YouTube. I was really afraid to click on it, but it was actually really good and only a half hour. At least I think it was good anyway, but they went into plate tectonics and they went into the Coriolis effect and showed that like the poles don't really move. It's that the other things around the poles moved. The poles moved a little bit, but it's not like, the North Pole was ever like where New Brunswick, Canada is now and stuff like that. And how geology, so I'm almost done with reading, and again, by reading, I mean listening to, on Audible, a book called The History of the World by 25 Rocks. And it's really cool. It's not the best geology book. I actually read another book that's based on geology that I love. I think it was called The World Before Us. I might be wrong about that. And again, by reading, I mean listen to. I don't have the attention span to read that, but listening to it, I love that stuff. And it's just fascinating that you could figure out where continents were and sort of why there's rocks that only exist in Greek islands and in Northwest United States and Southwest Canada and Patagonia and like somehow also New Guinea or whatever. And somehow these things make sense when you figure those things out, and why there's skeletons of dwarf pygmy hippos like on Sardinia or whatever.
Oh my goodness, that was like a lot of tangents.
That is my specialty, just tangents. And the problem with the tangents is that I forget where I started in the first place. But I do remember, because the premise of this was similar. So, I do remember. You mentioned continental shelves. Before we move to continental shelves, can we just, and I know that you don't have a checklist of the 9 different grades of oil or the 10 different grades of oil or whatever, but the basic differences in the grades and sort of like the sort of categories of different kinds of uses for them. And I'm not holding you to the exact grade for the exact thing, but sort of the basics on that, if there is such a thing as basics in this context.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the lighter the crude or the sweeter the crude, the closer it's going to be to things like gasoline. Gasoline is relatively light. It's one of those products that there's been cases where in the past you could almost just put it directly into your car and it would run, right? Now, modern day fuels are more complicated. We have additives to them to bring up what we call as their octane level, but that aside, they can be quite light, and they'll have things in that vein that are lighter fuels. The heavier it is, so different grades, I think, and I'm going to be stretching myself, is both about the weight or how sludgy or how many different carbon bonds are inside that particular liquid, but it's also what the stuff with it that comes with it. So sulfur, for instance, high sulfur crude versus low sulfur crude. But the sulfur is just something you don't want. It's just a byproduct. It happens to be there. It's part of the whole geological sequence. You end up with sulfur in it, and you got to remove it. But the heavier it is, you're going to things like tar and asphalt and stuff like that. So these heavier distillates, as they would call them, are on that side. And that's what the American refineries are really good at, and able to produce those at really low cost and sell them at a high margin, right? So you're able to. That's why they're so successful, and why they drive me crazy, because my gasoline always goes up and almost never comes down, even though the oil price comes down pretty quick.
Ours fluctuates quite a bit, at times, which is often what elections hinge on, or at least it's one of the biggest predictors. These are things that are probably intuitive to someone who thinks about it, but they weren't intuitive to me. But I mean, I always knew that trucks ran on diesel and some cars ran on diesel, but I never thought that it was like a different grade of fuel. And like, I know airplane fuel burns hotter. That was the whole thing. We all learned about airplane fuel after 9/11. But it never occurred to me that you needed a different grade of petroleum or a different level of refining for airplane fuel. I mean, it makes sense in hindsight. I didn't know that petroleum jelly might come from a different level of refining. That plastics, like you're so bad.
Maybe the thing you should think about is that although it takes more initial energy to release it, the heavier the substance or the more carbon bonds, the more energy actually in that fuel. So diesel per weight has more energy in it than gasoline does. And they actually burn at different temperatures. And you can think about this in the sense that if you put diesel into your car just doesn't run. It just doesn't do anything. Right. You haven't destroyed it. If you can manage to get all the diesel out and refill it with gasoline, you're fine.
Right.
Put gasoline in a diesel truck, though, you're going to probably destroy the engine. Mm-hmm. Because the diesel combusts at a higher temperature.
Right.
And so now all of a sudden you're putting gas in there and hitting it with this higher temperature, and all of a sudden the forces are all different, and you're going to probably destroy your engine.
Okay. Wow. There's so much there, and I mean, there's even different grades of plastics. Like we even thought about different grades of plastic and different grades of like ointments from like Aquaphor and Neosporin to regular Vaseline petroleum jelly and hundreds of things in between. So if I ever find the chart again, I will post it on my Facebook and all my socials. And so if you don't follow me and you want to see that one day, you can follow me and I'll be fine. Or if you found it, the little chart, it was a nice little it was a pictograph. So you can send it to me. I love it. But yeah, so on this YouTube show that I saw on continental shelves, one of the things, so I've been told by lots of people that there is no actual definition that's agreed upon as to what is a continent. And I learned that's not exactly true, that there is agreed upon factors. And at least two of them are remembered, two I know. One, got to be a whole lot of rocks. You got to have have different types of rock. You can't have just igneous. You got to have a bunch of rocks to qualify, and there has to be at least a certain threshold of between your crust and your mantle before you go down, like versus like the seafloor where you've got like a small level of igneous rock under the seafloor, and then you're into the mantle, I think is the right word. I'm sure that you can say that better. And there was a third criteria and I can't possibly remember. It was something about land features, or maybe had to do with being under a plate, or above a plate, not under a plate.
Okay, so why don't I just kind of regurgitate a sentence. So a continental shelf is the area of the seabed around a large landmass where the sea is relatively shallow in comparison to the open ocean. The continental shelf is geologically part of the continental crust. So that's what gets back to the rocks part. So I guess first off, what is continental crust? Well, continental crust is something that's lighter than oceanic crust. It's too light. It will not go through something called subduction. So the idea here is when you have two land masses smack into each other and they form the Himalayas, like India, and so that's the Indian-Australian plate versus China, or the Asian plate, sorry. When they smack into each other, all that continental crust will not go into the mantle. It's too light. The density is too low, so it all crumples up. So the continental, by meaning continental shelf, is that the underlying crust there is too light to subduct into the mantle if it were to collide with another plate. That's what that means there. The other thing to mention is between continental crust and oceanic crust. Oceanic crust, I just said there's a difference in density. Well, it's because of that density difference that the ocean floor is a lot deeper than the area around the continental shelf. Because it is so much denser, it actually sinks into the mantle. Much like a glacier, when it gets removed, the crust starts to rebound. You can think of that higher density causes it to sink a little lower into the mantle, causing the ocean depth to be greater over that area.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. Thank you for making sense out of what I probably put out was a word salad that barely made any sense. And so, again, everything on the garden shows is relevant to the garden shows because it's just things that I'm curious about and don't know about and want to learn about, or I found a guest that wants to talk about something. But this actually ties into sort of two of the three faces of the garden show. In A, this has to do with geopolitics. Two, it has to do with sort of ancient histories and ancient mythologies, because there are, I mean, I guess I'm going to just say 18,000 years ago or longer, the ocean was 400 feet lower. In other words, it's 400 feet higher now than it was then-ish. And I'm not sure it all happened overnight, of course. That's because more water was captured in glaciers, because it was, the glacial maximum, the height of our most recent ice age, which I'm not going to say more on that because we'll just get sidetracked. But we've discovered, and by we I mean humanity. In this case, who knows who these particular we's are. But so there's Doggerland, which is land between Britain and sort of Denmark and France and Scandinavia. There's Sunderland, which is land between Australia and all of like Southeast Asia, including some of the island nations, etc. There's Zealandia, I believe, which is a continent twice the size of India, that only New Zealand right now is above sea level for. And there's probably others as well. And of course, all of it is Atlantis to somebody, or their Ultima Thule or their Hyperborea or Tartaria, whatever, you want to put it, Shangri-La, it doesn't matter. But there are ruins there. And this has a geopolitical aspect, because if you can identify the ruins and the archaeology and eventually get to anthropology in who it was, countries can lay claims to those places based on genetics. And if they do, they can make arguments, I suppose, for the expansion of their territorial waters or even continental shelves, which may or may not change. But I don't know that the geologists have more political clout than say, sort of those dealing with ethnopolitics, so to speak, or genetic politics, so to speak. So it could be, you could have all these ancient cities and towns and villages leading to sort of an arms race as to what submerged areas belong to what countries, continents, empires, whatnot. And of course, there's resources under those, which means exploitation of resources. And of course, some people will try to preserve the historical aspects of it, but just like always, you get a national park, but you get one national park and you'll get 18, development projects. So that's where it ties into the everything else. Did I do an okay job of explaining that?
Yes, however, it's a pretty big however. So there's the politics side of things, where people may choose to try to do in the far as making their claims legitimate on different things. And then there's the UN-backed treaty, which defines a lot of this stuff that most countries have signed on to, which is vastly different than making that anthropogenic link. Not saying that people won't use it, I'm saying they will, but it's not part of international law, so to speak.
So there's precedent right now. So theoretically, the international courts and possibly others would enforce the boundary lines as we know them now, regardless of whether or not
the issue comes where you have things that are overlapping. So you can imagine, how about I give a Canadian context one, which is absolutely silly and absolutely has nothing to do with anything, because it was just a silly thing. And they called it the Whiskey War. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
I'm interested.
Okay, so, in the Arctic, there's a lot of overlapping claims. And in this particular instance, I'm talking with Greenland and Canada, i.e. Denmark. And between the two, one of our islands, I think it's Ellesmere Island off the top of my head, there's this little island that's basically perfectly between Greenland and Ellesmere Island. And both the Danish and the Canadian, we claimed it for ourselves. And starting in the 1980s, we started to take turns, and I can't remember who did it first. I think it was actually Canada that did it first. You put up a flag, right, and leave a bottle of whiskey. That's what we did. And the Danes would leave schnapps or some other thing that I can't pronounce. And so they called it the Whiskey War. And this went on for decades, literally all the way up to 2022. So that's only like 3 years ago. This trading of bottles of whiskey, of like sending people and boats to this little tiny uninhabited island. There's nobody there, let's be clear. And they decided to settle that dispute, and now we've divided the island evenly.
Aww.
Yeah, it's one of those quirky, random little things. But you notice how the international law didn't really get involved. Now, if we want to go to something that is much more, I would say, dangerous or has the potential to be a problem, that would be the South China Sea. Because China's military is making islands in the sea and putting military bases on them.
Right.
And so while that doesn't extend their claims per se, but it's a lot harder to then take it from them when they have a military base that they built in the middle of this overlapping area where there's Japan, there's Philippines, it's China, it's Malaysia, and Taiwan. It's a complex mess.
Right, and if you build enough of these, and if you get exclusive economic zones, or at least a claim of right to exclusive economic zones, and you build enough of those, all of a sudden you've extended the borders of your country.
Or somebody has to go to war with you, right? Like that's the other option. It doesn't really matter if you're in contravention of international law. If you're not going to obey the law, that means somebody else has to go enforce it, right? And the UN, most of their laws are basically unenforceable. Right. Because they don't have a police force, they don't have a military, they don't have anything to enforce anything. And that's really dangerous here because the fisheries in that area is like 12% of the global fish catch. Like, it's huge, and we're just talking a little tiny area, right? We're not talking the whole west coast of North America or even the US or Canada. Like, it's a pretty small area. So it's quite a problem for those countries that are there, for sure. And that's kind of scary.
And China's already engaged in illegal fishing in pretty much every underdeveloped or under-militarized countries' waters, and like you said, most, this is one of the recurring subjects of the show, which is why I'm so pessimistic or cynical, is that it's like this is against international law, this is against international law. Sure. If you're a good citizen of the world, you will obey international law most of the time until it's not exactly in your interest. If you're not such a good citizen of the world and enough people want to, bomb Serbia at the same time, or Bosnia, and agree to put troops on the ground, then you maybe will stop the Kosovo massacre or something in Rwanda from happening. But if you're, say, Russia and you invade Ukraine, maybe not so much, independent, and insert whatever conflict in the world you want to right now, because there's plenty of them. And actually, I'm going to be recording, I think this Saturday or next Saturday, with Mike Hilliard from the Red Line podcast, and he's going to talk about other fun things that aren't entirely unrelated, but weird enclaves and exclaves of countries. Enclaves are like sort of states within states, but not always officially, and exclaves are parts of another country that are entirely within the boundaries of other countries. So it's like little enclaves of Russia all over the place. And it's not the only one. I mean, think of the Michigan Upper Peninsula being attached to Michigan. I mean, it all sounds foreign and wacky, but it's not. There's part of Malaysia that is, basically attached to Cambodia, when most of Malaysia is island. So it's all over the place. I'm sure there's New Jerseyans, talking about that with Staten Island right now, and who could say they're wrong? Well, New Yorkers can. But anyway, there's a whole lot of shaking going on, and we're also going to talk about little-known conflicts. And that was sort of the point, that there's lots and lots of conflicts out there, and there's really not much in the way of answers for most of them. Most people are not even aware of most of them. In fact, most people are not even aware that some of these places exist, or at least that there's separatist movements like Ossetia. I mean, most people in the U.S. have heard of the Kurds and Kurdistan, but I don't know that most people in Japan have heard of Kurdistan, because they didn't invade Iraq, and have to learn about it. So, and that's not even a comment on the Iraq War. It's just you learn news from being there. I never heard of the Kurds before, except for little Miss Muffet who sat in her tuffet eating her curds and whey. And that's what I knew the Kurds were. And I didn't know there was a people called the Kurds, spelled differently. And there's things like that all over the place. There's the Druze in Syria. There's the Yazidis. I mean, it's sometimes it's too much. It's too, your brain will just explode, and that's another thing. But maybe just my brain will explode, and then that'll end the show, won't it? Jeff, you want to take over my show when the brain explodes?
I can barely manage my own show.
Okay. Host of the Whimsical Wavelengths. You don't sound so whimsical right now.
Wow, come on. Sometimes it's serious, sometimes it's whimsical. But the reason why I say whimsical wavelengths is because science, fundamentally, when you're measuring anything, and I do mean anything, it's based on waves.
Do you want to expand on that? I mean, I know gravitation.
Well, just think about it. What is light? It's a wavelength.
Okay.
When we start talking about seasons, they're periodic, like a wave.
Mm-hmm.
When we start looking at ocean waves, there are waves. Seismic waves, they're a wave. When we start talking about, even in my own field, where we start looking at the propagation of electromagnetic waves, if we look at signals and measure gravity on the Earth's surface, we're still talking about the wavelength of an anomaly. It seems like no matter what we do in science, it kind of comes back to waves. I'm sure there's caveats and nuance, but
radio waves, microwaves.
Yeah.
Isn't there one of my random things? And luckily, this is not your field, so unless you know something about it, but we have, there's the whole Roy G. Biv. You got the rainbow. We have ultraviolet. We have infrared. We have black light. But I wonder, what do the others do? Like, we know what some of those things do. Like, what does yellow light do, or what does orange light do?
The grand scheme of things, nothing special. You can divide it better off into ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radiation.
Yeah.
So the idea here is obviously ionized radiation is bad. That's what causes your body to break down. That's, you have a hunk of plutonium, that's ionizing radiation. But basically everything below ultraviolet is non-ionizing radiation. And so you get hit with orange light, it's not going to change very much from getting hit with yellow light, and vice versa. They're just slightly different wavelengths, and that's it.
Until people make orange sunglasses, and then we found out that They Live was a documentary.
I have no idea what you're talking about there.
You don't know John Carpenter's movie, They Live, starring Roddy Piper?
I know who John Carpenter is. I know he made a lot of movies. Some of them were pretty terrible, and I didn't watch them all. So
They Live is good. They Live is a classic science fiction movie. It's worth a watch.
Okay.
And the rest of Roddy Piper was in it, and he actually acted, and nobody knew that he could. But a lot of wrestlers can act, but he didn't have much of an acting career thereafter. But anyway, not particularly important. So, all right. So where we left off, what was our actual topic, was that there is international law on continents, and so this whole continental shelf thing that's a big fear of mine. I can probably shelve it, but not entirely, with the caveat that there are bad actors in the world. But look,
you can't shelve it because there's overlying. It depends. It's very region specific. So the South China Sea is one, and as well as the Arctic, where you have Canada, the U.S., Russia, Denmark, etc., and where you have the U.S. and Russia claiming the same area of the continental shelf. I mean, it depends on, I guess, who the president is in the future, but sparks can fly. Let's just put it that way. So it's not something I feel you can shelf. You got to think that even the USGS, which does an amazing job 99.999% of the time, says, look, 13% of the undiscovered oil in the world is in the Arctic, and 30% of the undiscovered natural gas is in the Arctic. So we're talking about billions of dollars of resources that are out there. So I wouldn't necessarily shelve it. It's not necessarily something you need to be worried about today, perhaps, but yeah, it's definitely something to be concerned of moving forward, especially in a warming planet, and the ice is no longer a problem.
Right. And God forbid that anyone should even think about doing a world trust, where it's under some sort of receivership by...
Oh, God, no.
Right. It's not going to work. Right, a global government, the Illuminati, the whole thing, and it probably will have rife with corruption just like everything else. But it is better than having World War III or whatever world war we're up to at that point about it. Now,
profit sharing would probably be easier instead of that. You know what I mean? Agree to a set of rules and laws that area is underneath, but then have profit sharing instead of a trust. Oh my gosh.
Well, that's basically what I meant. More of cooperative than a trust. Yeah, no. Almost like how Alaska has it set up, and yeah. So profit share amendment accepted. So okay, good. That's I don't know who anybody would trust universally with it, but what's a country everybody likes? There is no country that everybody likes. I mean, does anyone have an issue with Paraguay? Probably Uruguay. I have no idea. So I'll just stop right now because the only nation I can nominate is the proud nation of Geophysicist.
Oh yes, where all the Jeffs get together.
That's right, and I can assure you that we will be double, triple, quadruple dipping, and it'll be rife with corruption, but the corruption will only inure to the benefit of Jeffs, and Jeffs with a J, because we don't like the false Jeffs. And we may think about getting rid of the ones with ERY as opposed to REY as well. So there's even inter-Jeff tensions in the Jeff.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, a whole level of world that I knew nothing about.
Now you do. Well, welcome to it. You are a Jeff. It's time. This is not a podcast. This is your initiation.
Oh my goodness.
Into the Illuma Jeffy. So
the Illuma Jeffy.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to be kicked out. I'm way too altruistic.
We have various options in the not-for-profit and tax-exempt arena. So you might be surprised. We
Tax-exempt arena.
Yes,
wow.
Yes, we in the tax-exempt space. We have tax planning as well. I mean, it's
Helldivers 3.
Yeah, we're not monsters exclusively. Anyway, I mean, at least until we wake up Cthulhu finally, and then game on. All right. Is there anything else about continental shelves that you wanted to tell me about, or that I did not give you a chance to talk about?
No, I think that covers everything.
And we probably went as far with grades of oil as you're comfortable with, and I've certainly gone way past my knowledge base on it.
Once you get past that, you're really starting to get into the nitty gritty of like the chemistry and stuff like that. And I'm a geophysicist, not a geochemist.
Well, listen, tell us about your stuff then.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Whimsical Wavelengths has just entered season 2. I do my best to make sure that if I have a guest or I'm doing one of my own papers, that whoever's listening understands the reason why that study was even done, and then how those affect real life, whether that is looking at the accretionary disks of black holes, or the fat global network of ice cream and why ice cream tastes the way it does and the sensation it gives you in the mouth, or in the most recent one that just was my own past paper looking at basaltic Plinian eruptions of Messiah volcano. So if you know anything about volcanoes, basaltic and Plinian should be an oxymoron, because basalt, low viscosity gas can come out of it. It doesn't explode in this big, massive way. But we know from the rock record that it does happen occasionally. We've never visually observed it. And so I don't want to give the game away. I want people to go listen to it. But there is some scientific reason why we think, or we've come up with a scientific hypothesis, if you will, of how this can happen. And yeah, there's a reason why it's quite rare. And it's only relegated to like Etna and Messiah. And there's a couple others that I can't remember off the top of my head, but there's not many.
Is this named after Pliny the Elder, who died in Pompeii?
Yes, and I know I made the same joke about Rome in that particular episode too, because I was like, damn it, I'm talking about the Roman Empire again.
Yeah. Apparently Pliny the Elder actually was like acting like quite the hero during the volcanic eruption, and it was his nephew, Pliny the Younger, who wrote about it. So
yeah, and that's the reason why we call them Plinian eruptions. And for anyone who's not following along, that's due to the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. There was Pliny the Elder was a naturalist and author and, a big brain of his time. And so his younger nephew is the one who wrote it, Pliny the Younger. I mean, aren't you glad you're not Jeff the Younger?
Yeah, definitely so. And it was Pompeii, right?
Yeah, it was Pompeii. That was the same eruption that covered Pompeii, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, very good. So yeah, we did the Roman Empire twice in one show. This is fantastic.
It's outstanding.
We got in Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. So, I feel like mission's accomplished. So they can find you at the Whimsical Wavelength. Is there any particular channel that you're on platform? Are you Spotify exclusive, or are you?
No. I've everywhere audio podcasts are found. I also publish to YouTube, but it's just a click of a button. There's no video or anything like that. Better off to go through Spotify or Apple. And if you haven't already done so for this podcast here that I'm on, you should go and rate and subscribe. And then make sure you do the same for me, because rating actually brings new people in. I can't stress that enough. Especially leaving a written review, it's huge for us.
It really is. I don't stress that enough. I'm sort of almost afraid to at times. if there's a song, I mean, the other one when I did Shake, Rattle, and Roll, obviously the song was Shake, Rattle, and Roll.
I thought I did Volcano by the Dead Presidents of America or something like that.
You did do Volcano, that's right. So what song should we use as the outro for this show? This was, two almost entirely different topics, though not necessarily, depending what's under that water.
I don't know. I could give you my podcast music. It's a whole thing. I actually got somebody to perform it, so it's no longer AI. I could send you that as a link, and you can throw that in at the end.
Absolutely. Deal. Perfect. Love it. Host guest privilege. Absolutely. All right. So definitely give Whimsical Wavelengths a follow. Check it out. Give them a rating. Give them a review and all that other good stuff. And yeah, if you haven't done it for me yet, do it for me. And if you're here because you're a fan of Dr. Jeff Zurek as opposed to Dr. Jeff Lippman, where we don't use that honorific, but apparently it's not wrongful to do so. You can, maybe subscribe to my show too, and you'll get generally 2 to 3 shows a week. One is sort of like this. I think you got a flavor of me. It's like, it actually is things that apply to the real world, but I almost try to make them whimsical and dark comedy in some way, but that's just my nature. I also do a show where I co-host with professional wrestlers. Right now it's called The Gospel of Thomas because my primary co-host is Mr. Thomas from Major League Wrestling. And we talk to people in wrestling, but generally about non-wrestling things. I've had a bunch of other guest co-hosts, including Vinny Pacifico, Akira Kwan, and one of our other guys, Zico the Freako. He actually DM'd me today and asked if I was willing to have him as a guest host with his tag team partner, Rajit Raju, who I remember from Impact and TNA Wrestling. I'm like, yeah. Oh yeah, of course. So who knows? We may have more guest co-hosts than co-hosts. And I do a bunch of podcasts on the Wrestling Suit Network as well. So if you're interested in anything of that, check it out. And I don't know where it's going, but so it seems like that's a good enough time to say thank you to Dr. Zurek and goodbye to everyone.
Adios.
Very Canadian.
Lost in the fog of a cosmic storm, floating on whimsical wavelengths is the norm. Dancing through the stars, chasing spectrums of light, riding the waves that are just out of sight. In a world so chaotic, so misbehaved, echoes of melodies remind us it's all waves. Colors weave stories painting the sky, swaying to rhythms as the galaxies fly by.